One of the most controversial things about the Bible is the idea that science has completely contradicted it, that science has shown how everything began and therefore there's no need for God, as Stephen Hawking famously said. But I want to challenge that, not by saying there's no credibility to science, but actually going the opposite direction, showing that science is indeed very credible, but so is the Bible. Let me show you why. It was the Irish bishop, James Ussher, who took the genealogies of the early chapters of Genesis and he added up the years that each of the fathers lived and died and added those years up to work out a creation date from Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 of around about 3994 to 4004 BC. What Bishop Ussher forgot, or perhaps didn't know, was that the genealogies actually skipped lots and lots of generations, which threw his calculation out by a minimum of thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands of years. So you end up with a creation date for Adam, not 4000 BC, not 6000 BC, not even within 10,000 BC, but upwards of over 100,000 BC. Let me show you, even from Matthew chapter 1, that the Bible uses genealogies quite different than perhaps the way Bishop Ussher thought they were meant to be used. In Matthew chapter 1, we have the genealogy of Jesus Christ, but it is an abbreviated genealogy. Now we know that simply by looking at it in Matthew chapter 1 and comparing it with the genealogical records we have in the Old Testament. At one point, Matthew skips 3 generations. And when we go into the Old Testament, we'll see that they did the same thing. There would often be someone called the father of, but in Hebrew thinking, that expression could mean grandfather or great-grandfather or even great-great-grandfather. There's examples of this all through Scripture. We see other instances where the genealogies that Bishop Ussher used to calculate the age of the earth were actually, when you compare them with other genealogies, you can see, hang on a minute, there's other names here, there's other generations here that weren't included in that genealogy. And that raises the question, when the people compiling the genealogies were listing these names, what was their criteria? Well, their criteria was very simple: to tell a story. They took prominent people to tell a story. Not every generation is listed, and that's why it's impossible to calculate the age of the earth from the genealogies. This means that you can quite literally arrive at a biblically concordant, that means it concords with science, of the origin of the human species. Now, science tells us that human beings appeared on Earth relatively recently. And relatively recently, in scientific terms, is probably around about 100 to 150,000 years, possibly even a little bit more. Well, there's nothing in the biblical record that contradicts that. Nothing at all. In fact, when we look at what Scripture describes as God creating in Genesis chapter 1 through to chapter 2 verse 3, we see that what we see there listed as the progression of creation is exactly what the fossil record tells us. So some people claim that the day, the word day, the Hebrew word Yawn in Genesis, always means 24 hours. But that's not the case. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4, immediately we see that word Yawn encompasses the entire 6 days of God's creative activity. And we see throughout Scripture that it refers to 12 hours, it refers to an epoch of time, it refers to an era. And so this word Yawn is not unequivocal in the sense that it always means one thing in every instance that it's used. It is equivocal. It means what it means in the context. And so when we see Genesis chapter 1, it's quite within the realms of possibility. In fact, I would argue that it actually means an extended period of time. That's the word Yawn. Other people have said that what we have in Genesis is 6 consecutive 24-hour days, and in that time there was no death. But if we take those as being long periods of time, indeterminate, unspecified, long periods of time, there must have been death. And they base this on a verse in Romans chapter 5, which is misread to say that death came to everything because of Adam's sin. But that verse doesn't actually say that. What it says is that death came to mankind. Now that's a world of difference between saying death came to everything and death came to mankind. So there's a difference. There's a number of other things that we can see that the Bible and science actually concord. Now, when we say science, we mean that which is verifiable by the evidence. One of the big things that the Bible states is that the origin of life has a supernatural, beyond the natural cause. Science must, and it has to point to something beyond what is natural as the origin of life. So they are in concordance. Of course, there are some people who believe that Darwin explained the origin of life and how all species developed from a single life form. But the science doesn't actually support that. Darwin didn't know anything about genetics. And over on the reasonstobelieve.org site, you'll see biochemists like Dr. Fazal Rana, who has pointed out why this cannot be scientifically credible. So I think you'll find that as you look at the Bible and you look at Genesis chapter 1, you'll see that it does concord with what science tells us. This gives us tremendous credibility that the God who created heaven and earth, who created all vegetation, all microbial life forms, all animal life forms, and ultimately human beings, is the same God that has determined the laws that He's written in our heart, the laws that determine what is for human flourishing and what is going to hinder human flourishing. And I think as you look at the Bible, you'll discover that there's a different way to live according to the standards that are being proposed today. Well, thanks for watching this. I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to this channel. It encourages me and it helps to get the word out that we're dealing with some of the most difficult Bible conundrums.